African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as aviation, sports, business, literature, music, politics, and education. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. Joining us on today's program is Dr. Irving Hamer, who's a Manhattan representative on the New York City Board of Education. Irving, glad to have you with us today on African American Legends. And you have a tremendous job. I won't say thankless, because the millions of people who get the benefit of this education will thank you sometime in the next millennium. But right now, as we come to the close of the millennium of the 20th century, what are your priorities as the Manhattan representative on the Board of Education?
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to our time together, and I think the decision to join this board was a very difficult one for me and for my family, but I think it's an important piece of work to do. I think it's the most important piece of work that I could do. It's the most important way that I can contribute to the wealth and well-being of our community.
Just for the public's information, this is not a high-paying job.
Oh, no, it's not a high-paying job at all.
This is a job that's somewhat thankless in some ways.
Well, it doesn't pay a mortgage, I can assure you of that, right? But you asked about my priorities. I essentially have two priorities that I've staked out for myself that I hope to sort of get some work done over the next 48-month term of my tenure on the board. The first has to do with what I call low-performing schools. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And the second has to do with capital infrastructure, the physical facilities of the system.
See, it's very interesting that you picked systemic variables rather than the rhetoric about making every child learn about the democracy, et cetera. You picked systemic variables. And in my CUNY responsibility, as you know, I'm the director of the Center for Urban Education Policy, and my eyes just lit up when you talked about low-performing schools.
Right.
And the physical conditions of our schools are just horrendous in many instances. I go to dozens of schools, particularly in the inner city community, and unfortunately the conditions are really worse than are generally described in the public. I mean, just simple things like the paint on the walls, the cracks in the windows.
Yes.
So you were right on target. You've already accomplished a lot by just identifying the targets.
Well, the physical condition of the buildings is a 25-year sort of legacy of deferred maintenance. The city and the state have put almost no money into maintaining and or fixing and or constructing new buildings. I mean, part of the reasons that some of the buildings are in such bad shape is that they're woefully overcrowded. There are too many young people in some of these buildings. We've got an influx of students that is really off the charts and no physical space to accommodate them. Now, that being said, it's also true to say that we've not managed our physical assets very well. We've not had an asset management orientation to the school buildings.
Hasn't part of that been that arcane contract with the custodians, whereby the buildings are actually taken care of by people who are outside of the bureaucracy?
Well, but it also is a consequence of the 1973 fiscal crisis, when building physical structures were the last to get any kind of financial support. We now have a new structure. The legislature put in a new structure called the School Construction Authority. They now have the responsibility of taking care of the buildings. I must say, on the positive side of the school construction sort of and maintenance activity, that the Construction Authority has done a remarkable job in building new buildings. In the last 5 years, we've constructed, I think, 93,000 new seats. That's not our problem. What you're describing is not the problem of new construction. When a parent or a student or a teacher, a person like yourself, goes into a building that's been standing for 100 years and it's all broken down, that's not new construction. Here we're talking about maintenance and rehabilitation. The School Construction Authority and the Central Board of Education has been dreadful in its capacity to do rehabilitation and maintenance work. So when the paint is peeling, when the bathrooms don't work, when the windows are cracked and water is coming in through the walls, all that's a problem of maintenance and rehabilitation, and we've not been good at managing those assets. So I'm determined to try to sort of bring a wisdom, a passion, a fire, and anger to making sure that we create and maintain physical construction and our physical assets better than we've done it over the last 25 years or so.
See, you've already earned a gold star for that, because for years, your predecessors and so on have tried to focus on this, but you know, time causes things to get worse.
Right. Yeah.
And now, when you have buildings crumbling and a brick falls and hits somebody and so on, people get attention. But you have to keep the pressure on. Right. Past that particular incident.
Sure, right, yeah. These incidents can come and go. People have very short memories. There was a girl killed by a falling brick. That should never happen again. We shouldn't even have a conversation about the physical facilities. When people go to work, they're not worried about their physical facilities or their surroundings. They take those for granted. Children, parents, teachers ought to be able to take for granted that they're going to a relatively safe, comfortable, warm, dry place to do the business of teaching and learning. On the very same ledger, from my point of view, is the problem of low-performing schools, so that when the critics of public education are the most critical, and when they're the most successful with their criticism, what they're talking about in this city are 150, 200, maybe 300 low-performing schools. The rest of the schools in the city do reasonably well, and some do extraordinarily well, world class.
Because some may say that this really reflects society.
Oh, that's true.
You got the top,
right.
You got the upper, you got the middle, and you got the lower.
Right.
And the sad thing that I'm concerned about is that so many of the lower are in neighborhoods which are predominantly African American and Latino and poor, poor Caucasian.
Increasingly Caribbean now.
And it represents a combination of political will and the commitment of the society to the least of these. However, as you know, the society is changing, whereas we used to put people to work in the garment district and the coal mines and so on. Those jobs don't exist anymore.
Can't do that anymore, right.
So the survival of that upper 80% is really dependent on the quality of education for the lower 20%.
Yeah. Well, it's always sort of been like that, but for different reasons, right? The upper always depended upon the garment district, and as long as they had a relatively low educated, low earning person to staff those facilities, the upper levels of the society could support themselves. They can't do that anymore, right? Now they need a different kind of worker to support the structure and the hierarchy.
Just the technology, the computers to run the machines.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't own a franchise of McDonald's and not have a technologically sophisticated employee capable of reading and writing and making judgments. So I think that the system has not had, in my judgment, an adequate focus on breaking the back of what I call low performance. The low performance is systemic. So the very same school that some parent or some civic leader would criticize today for being poorly performing was low performing 30 years ago, 35 years ago. There's a real pattern.
And there's an economic, there's a socioeconomic variable.
There's also, it's located in low-income communities. So, you show me a school with very high incidence of children who are registered for school lunch. The probability is that it will be a low-performing school. Now, there are outliers.
That's what I was about to say.
There are definitely outliers.
Successes.
Oh, there's some amazing successes, right, which teach us that it's possible for all the children and not just for a few. Said another way, it is possible to go to the most poverty-stricken communities in the city and find some extraordinary schools and children performing at very, very high levels. If it can happen in a few of those situations, right, I'm led to believe, I believe deeply, that it's possible for it to happen for lots of children, and that it shouldn't be just one or two schools, right? And so the question is, what are the operational policies? I mean, what do we have to think about in order to sort of make sure that we break the spine of low performance? And I think that there are some policy issues appropriate to my seat on this board to try to change this tradition.
Let's talk about one of those policy initiatives. The State Board of Regents, under Commissioner Richard Mills, has raised the standards for graduation. They're not going to have a general diploma anymore, just a certificate, and you're going to have to pass 5 or 6 Regents level high quality exams. which looks good on the paper. However, let's take mathematics. I think in New York City, they only have about 50% of the mathematics teachers, 60% who are licensed.
Right.
In the area of science, half of the high schools don't have science laboratories.
Right.
So then the question is sort of a chicken egg. You raise the standards, do you just continue to exclude people so that the people who do get through are really good, but the rest of the people fall through?
Right.
That's a real dilemma. I have my own views about it. I'd like to hear yours.
Well, it's a fascinating dilemma, and I think there's a little bit of a background piece here that's worthy of the observation that you make. For most of the century, in this state, we've had really two systems. We had young people who were put through the system for the purposes of getting a Regents diploma, an academic diploma, preparing them for college primarily. But if they decided with their Regents diploma not to go to college, they were very highly employable anyplace else in this city, in this state. All the other children were getting what you rightly identified as a general diploma or vocational diploma, not necessarily focused on preparing them for a college experience, and really suspect in its ability to prepare them for the world of work. What this state has said, and I think very courageously, one ticket for everybody. Everybody's going to have the same basic qualification when they come out of school. The point, and I honor that. I think that's a very important way of sort of trying to reduce the distinction between folks on the basis of race, class, gender. You know, everybody has to have a Regents diploma. It does present a new set of challenges for the new millennium, which is how do you get everybody coming up to the algebra, the geometry, the biology, and the chemistry necessary now to get out of high school, and how in districts where we've not been generous with our supports, do we put the supports in to make sure that children could get access to the instruction that they need to have? I mean, where do we get the people? How do we certify them? How do we make sure they can teach algebra and geometry and do the physics and do the chemistry? And I think those are real challenges. I can't sit here and say, Dr. Brown, that I have the answers to those. I think they're the new challenges that we have to try to figure out. We have to get the political will to do that. We have to respond to the regulatory requirement, and we need the expertise in the teachers and the administrators in the school buildings to deliver this experience. But also, parents and communities need to sort of figure this out. And I want to say something quite heretical. At least I think it's heretical. I think the standards are up. The playing field, you know, is not equal for everyone. It never has been, likely will not be. But it's real important that families, your listening audience, get really clear that they should not be relying on the local school to totally educate their children. The standards are really up much higher. The likelihood that there will be teachers not certified to teach the algebra and the geometry is relatively high in lots of schools, but that should not stop a family from trying to figure out how to get some supplementary experiences for their children in order that they pass the language and the math and the science requirements for getting out. I think one of the things that this says, at least during this period of time, where persons like myself are trying to figure out how we're going to make the playing field equal for all folks, which I think is going to be a real challenge. I think we should not have generations not stepping up to the plate and meeting the challenges. And I think it puts a little bit more burden of responsibility on families to find supplementary experiences after school, on the weekends, and in the summer.
Well, not only on families, but on social agencies.
On social agencies as well.
For example, the 100 Black Men, which I'm former president, has an extensive mentoring program. Working with the children.
That's exactly
the
right.
Beacon schools, which have been started with under the Dinkins administration, that carry the school building up until 11 o'clock at night. The virtual Y from the YMCA. So those are issues that are building the community's involvement. One of the things that I observe is sometimes there's a little bit too much rigidity on the part of the school itself, having parents and community groups come. The schools that do this well. But then they sort of are a mirror on the other side of schools that don't do it well, and some of which is class. I think there's a racial imbalance, an ethnic imbalance in the teaching staff. It's almost like I got mine, you got yours to get. On the other hand, in New York City public schools, about 82–83% people of color. So therefore, the future of the workforce is a workforce that's going to be a workforce of color. And the computers and the ability to handle concepts and to communicate clearly are clearly there. so that there is a tremendous necessity for this to happen. I guess the real question is, how fast do we do it? For example, a kid who's been going to school for 12 years, 1992 or 2002, when this new standard of 2003 comes in, they can't pass 2 of 5 Regents exams. Do you deny them the diploma? That means they can't get any kind of job? Probabilities, no.
Right.
So the probabilities are, even though we're setting the standards now, we've got a 10-year or 12-year period before that really comes into being, and that coincides with your tenure on the board.
Yeah, well, it does coincide with my tenure on the board, but the other thing to be said here is that I think the system and this Chancellor Crew is quite savvy, I think, in trying to think of the system as being performance-driven. And one of the things that performance-driven means to me is that it's not necessarily time-sensitive. So that a child should not be locked into a 12-year time frame.
Or a 9-month school year.
Or a 9-month school year in order to get the performance that we need for them to demonstrate in order to qualify for the diploma. So I think that the 9-month school year is, you know, all bets need to be off. We need to be figuring out how to get the legislature, the state education department, our city council, our mayoral folks, the unions to get behind extending the school year because the standards are higher. Some children are going to require, lots of children are going to require more time on task in order to meet the standard to graduate. I'm of the opinion that every child should meet the standard, but we need to do the structural changes to make it possible for them to achieve it. You don't take the extended standard and try to jam it into the same old glass and say now, regardless of who you are, where you've come from, you've just come from the Dominican Republic, we don't care. You don't speak English, we don't care. You have to pass this test at this date. It's the wrong way to do it, right? The way to do it is to say, you have to pass this test, it's likely to take more time on task, here's how we're going to restructure the system. So maybe it'll take 5 years to graduate from high school. I think that's okay, as long as the child gets to the level of performance that will make them eligible to pass the exams and able to get employment opportunities or do a university enrollment, whatever their choices happen to be. So I think the system is in a very turbulent transitional time, which is personally very exciting. I mean, I like the idea of being in the mix. Even though it does take a lot of time, it's very hard, there's an awful lot of dissatisfaction, there's an awful lot of skepticism about what's possible. But it is an exciting time.
And it's resource-driven.
And it's resource-driven, there's no question.
I'm involved with the Council on Fiscal Campaign for Fiscal Equity to equalize the funding. Where New York City has something like 38% of the students and gets 35% of the funds. So if society really is serious about this, society has to step up. And then there's the other question of, would we create a permanent underclass if we allow a significant number, 20, 25%, of the students in the public schools not to get those skills? These are really millennium questions.
They really are.
Just like the question of the 20th century, as Du Bois said, was the color line, and the question of labor and all those issues. The millennium question is, how are we going to raise the quality of education so that everyone can participate in the goodness and the broad spectrums of society? And I'm concerned that, particularly in some of our minority communities, we are so much concerned with music and sports and snapping your fingers that, and that's rewarded by the society for a certain small number getting great rewards out of it. We are tending to lose the beauty and the joy and the importance of education. We've had that argument about black English and so on. True enough, idiomatic English, everybody speaks it, but in terms of being able to pass a test, being able to get a job, you've got to speak standard English.
At least be able to write it.
And our society in the black and Latino communities have to internalize that. At the same time, they are concerned about preserving their culture because they think it's a put down if people laugh at it. So you really have a job. Now, one of your main allies should be parents. How do you feel about increasing the role of parents? You have the school leadership teams now that are required by law under the new governor's legislation. How do you feel about that? How can we do that better?
Well, I think I think the 100 Part 11, originally in Chancellor's regulations and now part of the governance law mandating that these leadership teams be put in place, is really quite exciting. It's a real challenge, however, for some districts where parent participation has always historically been low, to get to 50% sort of participation on the part of parents. But this is an opportunity for parents, teachers, school administrators, and I say school custodians to get in the act, really sort of moving a school on a school-by-school basis down a path of higher achievement and higher performance. The law sort of requires that people sit at the table and figure it out. Now, it's going to be a long road. Some places it's going to work fabulously. Other places there's going to be a real tension, and there's a lot to learn about how to do this work. It is, in my judgment, however, legislated parental involvement. And there's a lot to be said about legislated parental involvement. There are all kinds of rules and guidelines for how parents can participate. But even if you are not, if you are a parent out there in television land watching this program, my view is get elected to the leadership team, because that's one clear place where you can begin to have a significant voice. But even if you don't get elected to the leadership team, I think parent involvement that is not legislated is absolutely the most powerful and the most important. So I encourage people to get themselves organized in a way to make sure, or to hook up with organizations that are not being driven by the Board of Education, not being driven by state law or state regulation, as a way of raising one's voice about the need to get the adequate resources, to meet the standards, to make sure the buildings are in some reasonably good functioning repair, to make sure that we are breaking the back of low performance. There are a bunch of themes that I think unlegislated parents ought to be sort of screaming about and making lots of noise about. Now, in other parts of the country, and there was a time here in New York City where there was a bunch of parental organizations that were very strong and they carried a lot of influence. I don't think that they're quite what they used to be here. And I know that the parent engagement and participation is not what it is in some places like San Antonio, Texas, and a few other communities around the country. It is absolutely essential that parents get themselves organized, both legislatively and independent of sets of rules and regulations, in order to keep the pressure on. There's some real big issues critical to the millennium, critical to children who are going to have to graduate with these Regents diplomas, that we need to be sure that folks are making sure that they're asking for and demanding the kinds of inputs, the kind of structures, the kind of reform necessary to make it possible for children to hit these standards.
You see, this is where you, in your role as a board member, can help. School districts ought to have more money to work in developing parental relationships, helping to improve. One of the things I've done in our Education Center for Education Policy here at CUNY is to work on a series of programs and plans to get parents involved in getting the skills to interact in school-based management and school leadership. You as a leader can certainly, because your description of this was absolutely eloquent, get some money to provide some support for these parent leadership teams. There needs to be that, because the Irving Hamons and Roscoe Browns of the world are going to do this anyway. We did it when our kids went to school. But a lot of people who have been not well received by the schools, who are very busy, who are uncomfortable at the variable schools, not going to do that. And those are the folks we need to pull into the
I think that's right. And the Chancellor's plan for the leadership team, I think, does make $10,000 available for each team to work with. I don't think it's adequate, but it's a small piece. It's a start. It's a real start. And it ought to be spent on training the teams and the members of the teams on how to do the work of being on the leadership team. I'm a little nervous, Dr. Brown, about I don't want to co-opt parents, right? I mean, one of the problems that's possible with the leadership teams and the funding of the leadership teams is that they will get co-opted.
They get very.
And it's a danger of this kind of structure. This is what I mean by legislated parental involvement. I'm for it. We have to be careful not to get them totally co-opted. But I'm real eager. This comes from my own.
But you have been the president of the Public Education Association, which has been very aggressive about getting parents and other community leaders involved in the schools. outside of school bureaucracy.
Right,
so
yes.
in some way, you're carrying water on both
Yeah,
shoulders.
that's exactly right.
Having been on the outside, saying you ought to do this,
Right.
now you're on the inside.
Right.
As we come to the close of our conversation, how do you now feel about being a Board of Education member? You have been the president of the Public Education Association. You've been in the publishing business. You've been raising hell about what's not happening. Now you are the establishment. How do you feel about
Well,
that?
I tell you, some days it's a terrible feeling, right? I've been at board meetings where people have called me some real ugly names. They've been really annoyed. I've had to make some very unpopular votes recently. It is, you said, the top
unpopular in terms of voting a school board out of existence or
well,
something
either,
like that?
well, I mean, the most rancorous recently was the school safety issue, right? The general perception that I was voting to put armed police officers in buildings. I was not doing that. I worked very hard to make sure that that didn't happen. But I did vote, however, for the transfer of the school safety operation from the Board of Education to the police department. I've said and will continue to say the Board of Education is not a security organization. It ought to be concentrating all of its resources and attention on teaching and learning. But some people who've known me for a very long time are very annoyed at me, have said some very mean, unkind things to me about this particular role. I think it goes along with the territory, so I think I can still manage a smile, and I can still say to you, I'm thrilled to be in the action, right? I think I've a particular set of experiences. I think it's the most important thing that I could possibly be doing. So, you know.
A very esteemed president, Harry S. Truman, had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here."
Right, yeah.
And
right.
one of the challenges to an advocate and someone who believes in public education like you is to accept that challenge, accept that buck,
Right.
and to continue to communicate.
Right.
And for that reason, we're very pleased to have had you talking with us about education on African American legends. Thanks very much to Irving Hamer, Manhattan member of the Board of Education, for being with us today.
Thank you a lot for having me.